wind screamed across the Kansas plain, tearing at the lone figure stumbling through the sagebrush. Behind her, lantern light bobbed, relentless, hungry. Rain, sharp as flung gravel, lashed her face. She clutched her threadbare shawl, breath ragged sawdust in her throat. A gnarled root snagged her boot. She fell hard, mud cold against her cheek. Something small and pale skittered from her hair into the darkness. A single, delicately carved bone hairpin. Hoofbeats drummed closer, vibrating through the sodden earth. She scrambled up, vanishing into the storm's black maw. What desperate flight began beneath that merciless sky? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special saved just for you. The wind that howled like a banshee across the open prairie tonight before now scraped against the clapboard walls of Vaughn's Mercantile in Bleakwood, Kansas, with the persistence of a dull blade. Inside the cramped, airless attic room above the store, Abigail Reed felt every gust as a physical pressure, a reminder of the world's indifference. Dust motes, illuminated by a single shaft of weak, gray light piercing a grimy window pane, danced in the stale air. The room held little more than a narrow cot piled with thin blankets, a rickety stool, and the battered trunk that held the dwindling remnants of her former life. 7 months into her pregnancy, the child within her was a constant, heavy presence, a knot of hope tangled with dread beneath her worn calico dress. Every movement, bending, lifting, even the simple act of drawing breath, required effort, a negotiation with her own straining body. Below, the murmur of the store was a constant, low hum, punctuated by the sharp clang of the doorbell. Abigail's domain, however, was silence and dust. Elias Vaughn's shelter was a prison of indebted labor, paid for the coin of her dignity. The contract, signed with a trembling hand weeks after burying her husband, Samuel, felt like a lead weight in her chest. Indentured service, Vaughn had called it, his voice slick with false benevolence, until the debt for this room the provisions advanced is settled. The debt only ever seemed to grow. She shifted on the stool, the worn wood biting into her thighs. Before her lay a mountain of mending, shirts ripped by barbed wire, trousers worn thin at the knees, socks riddled with holes. Vaughn supplied the thread. She supplied the labor, hour upon grinding hour. Her fingers, once deft at tending her own garden or mending Samuel's shirts by lamplight, were now stiff and sore, the needle a tiny instrument of torture. She pushed it through thick denim, the rhythmic prick-pull echoing the dull ache behind her temples. A familiar wave of nausea rolled through her, sour and insistent. She closed her eyes, pressing a hand to her swollen belly, seeking the quiet flutter of life beneath the exhaustion. Hold on, little one, just hold on. The memory, sharp as a needlepoint, pierced her concentration. Samuel, tall and broad-shouldered, with laugh lines etched deep beside eyes the color of summer corn. He'd been clearing the new field, the one meant for the orchard they dreamed of. The old plow horse, usually steady as bedrock, had shied violently at a rattler coiled in the sun-baked earth. Samuel, trying to calm the beast, had been thrown with brutal force against the unforgiving blade of the turning plowshare. The image, the sudden stillness, the terrible crimson bloom on his faded work shirt, slammed into her with the force it always did, stealing her breath. She hadn't been there. She'd been at the well, drawing water, humming a tune. The neighbor boy had found him. The silence that descended on their homestead afterward was thicker than the Kansas dust, filled only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the crushing weight of her solitude. The farm, their dream, had been swallowed by debts almost before the earth settled on his grave. Bleakwood and Vaughn's mercy were all that remained. A sharp rap on the thin attic door jolted her back to the present. Before she could answer, it creaked open. Elias Vaughn filled the doorway, his broad frame blocking the dim light from a landing. He was a man built like a barrel, with a florid face above a starched collar that seemed perpetually too tight. His eyes, small and dark as currants, swept over her and a pile of mending with cold appraisal. "Progress, Mrs. Reed?" His voice was smooth, oiled with a false civility that never reached his eyes. He held a ledger tucked under one arm like a shield. "Yes, Mr. Vaughn," Abigail murmured, keeping her gaze lowered, focusing on the stubborn stitch she was wrestling with. Slowly. "Slow, don't settle accounts, widow." He stepped into the room, his polished boots tracking fine grit onto the bare floorboards. The scent of bay rum and pipe tobacco clung to him, cloying in a confined space. He peered at the mended shirt stacked beside her. Needlework's passable, I suppose, for a farm wife. The dismissal in his tone was a familiar sting. He tapped the ledger. Store credits mounting. Flour, beans, that bit of salt pork last week, and the rent for this space, of course. Mustn't forget the rent. He leaned closer, his shadow falling over her work. "You'll need to increase your output. Double it, perhaps. Winter's coming on, and goods won't fetch themselves." Abigail's throat tightened. Double? She could barely manage the current load before exhaustion claimed her each night, her back a rigid column of pain, her feet swollen and throbbing. Mr. Vaughn would respect the child. "I'm doing all I can." "Can't feed sentiment, Mrs. Reed," Vaughn said, his voice hardening. "Nor can it pay debts. You signed the paper. Work is the currency here. If you find the terms burdensome—" He let the implication hang, heavy and suffocating. There was nowhere else to go. The prairie beyond Bleakwood was a vast, indifferent maw. See that pile clear by sundown, and the new lot brought up from the storeroom needs sorting before morning. He turned, his bulk filling the doorway again. "Efficiency, widow. Mind your efficiency." The door clicked shut behind him. Abigail sat frozen, the needle trembling in her fingers. The weight of his words pressed down, heavier than the child she carried. Tears threatened, hot and shameful, but she blinked them back fiercely. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. It wasted time and precious moisture. She picked up another torn shirt, the coarse fabric scraping against her raw fingertips. The sunbeam through the window had crept further across the floor, marking the relentless passage of time she couldn't outrun. The afternoon wore on, a slow grind of pain and monotony. The dust in the air seemed to thicken, coating her tongue. Her water dipper, a chipped enamel cup, was empty. Thirst clawed at her, a persistent reminder of the meager rations Vaughn allowed her. Gathering her strength, she pushed herself up from the stool, a soft groan escaping her lips as her muscles protested. She needed water and perhaps, just for a moment, a breath of air less stale than the attic's. Descending the narrow back stairs felt like navigating a treacherous mountain path. Each step sent jolts through her weary legs. She emerged into the relative bustle of the store's back room, a cluttered space smelling of burlap, leather, and kerosene. Barrels of flour and sugar stood sentinel beside crates of tinned goods. Shelves grown under stacks of tinware and bolts of calico. She moved towards a water barrel in the corner, her movements slow and deliberate, just as she reached for the heavy tin dipper hanging beside the barrel. The back door swung open with a gust of wind, and a jangle of bell Vaughn had rigged there. Framed against the gray afternoon light was a man. Tall, lean as a whip, he seemed carved from the same weathered wood as the doorframe. He wore a duster coat the color of dried mud, spattered with trail dust, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing his face. His arrival was quiet, yet it instantly altered the room's atmosphere, like a stone dropped into still water. He carried the scent of the open range, sage, horse sweat, and something else faintly metallic, like old gun oil. Abigail froze, dipper in hand, suddenly conscious of her worn dress, her swollen belly, the dust smudged on her cheek. The man's gaze, when it lifted from scanning the room, landed on her. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, like river stones, but they held a distance, a guardedness that felt as impenetrable as stone too. He gave a curt nod, barely a dip at his chin. "Ma'am." Before she could respond, Vaughn bustled in from the main store, his earlier irritation smoothed into a veneer of shopkeeper's affability. though it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Holt, wasn't expecting your supply run till week's end. Trail treat you rough." Vaughn's gaze flickered dismissively towards Abigail. "Back to work, Mrs. Reed. The water can wait." Abigail flinched, humiliation heating her neck. She lowered the dipper, her knuckles white on the handle. The man, Holt, didn't look away from her. His expression didn't change, yet something shifted in those gray eyes, a flicker of assessment perhaps, or a spark of recognition for a hardship endured. His gaze dropped briefly to her rounded belly, then back to her face, holding hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. There was no pity there. She realized with a jolt. Something else. An acknowledgement. Then, without a word, he stepped past her towards Vaughn, his movements fluid and silent. "Needed staples sooner." Holt's voice was low, gravelly, as if disused. He pulled a list from his coat pocket. "Flour, coffee, beans, lead, powder. Of course. Got it all right here, just needs tallying." Vaughn rubbed his hands together, already calculating. "Heard some trouble down near Red Fork Way. Stage I held up. You passed through there?" Holt's response was a non-committal grunt as he surveyed the shelves. Abigail slowly dipped the water, the cool liquid a blessing on her parched throat. She watched in the corner of her eye as Vaughn gathered the supplies, his movements efficient, his attention fully on his customer now. Holt stood with a stillness that seemed unnatural, one hand resting lightly on the worn leather of his gun belt. His gaze occasionally swept the room, taking in details of the quiet intensity of a hawk. She noticed a scar then, a thin, pale line running from the corner of his left eye down towards his jaw, partially hidden by a day's growth of dark stubble. A journal, its leather cover cracked and stained, protruded slightly from his coat pocket. He looked like a man who carried his history etched onto his skin and bound in leather. Vaughn hefted a heavy sack of flour onto the counter with a thud. "That'll be the lot, Holt. Reckon you can manage loading it? My boy's off today." He glanced pointedly at the sack, then towards Abigail, a calculating glint in his eye. "Mrs. Reed here could." "I'll manage." Holt's voice cut across Vaughn's, flat and final. He didn't look at Abigail, but the refusal hung in the air, a shield thrown up unexpectedly. He reached for the sack himself, muscles bunching under his duster as he swung it onto his shoulder with deceptive ease. He picked up the box containing the other supplies with his free hand. Vaughn's smile tightened. "Suit yourself. Just tallying the bill." He turned to his ledger, pencil scratching. Holt paused near the door, adjusting the weight of the flour sack. His gray eyes met Abigail's again. They held no warmth, yet no cruelty either, just that same unsettling clarity. "Storm last night," he stated, his voice barely above the rustle of burlap. "Bad one. Saw tracks, riderless horse. Headed south. Woman's tracks, running hard." His gaze lingered on her face, searching for something. Recognition? Fear? Strange thing to see, out on the plain alone. Bleakwood hear anything? Folks gone missing? Abigail's breath caught. The fleeing woman from the hook. The hairpin lost in the storm. A chill unrelated to the draft seeped into her bones. Vaughn's head snapped up from his ledger, his face suddenly sharp, watchful. "Missing? No trouble here. Holt, just the usual riffraff passing through. Probably some squatter woman spooked by the lightning. Nothing to concern decent folk." His tone was dismissive, but his eyes darted between Holt and Abigail, a flicker of unease beneath the bluster. Holt held Vaughn's gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave that curt nod again. Likely, he pushed the door open with his shoulder, the gray daylight swallowing him as he stepped out into the wind. The bell jangled sharply behind him. Silence descended, thick and charged. Vaughn slowly closed his ledger, the sound unnaturally loud. He turned his full attention on Abigail, his earlier avarice replaced by a cold, simmering suspicion. The water dipper felt suddenly heavy, forgotten in her hand. The image of a woman running, The ominous question in Holt's gravelly voice, the bone hairpin lost in the mud. It all swirled in her mind, a sudden, terrifying mystery intruding on her desperate struggle. Vaughn took a step towards her, his polished boots loud on the wooden floor. "What did he mean by that, widow?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Running woman? Missing folk? You know something about that? Something you ain't told." His small, dark eyes bored into hers, stripping away the thin veneer of his shopkeeper's propriety, revealing the hard, predatory core beneath. The attic, the mending, her exhaustion, they all receded, replaced by the immediate, chilling threat in his voice and the unsettling echo of Jacob Holt's cryptic words hanging in the dusty air. The safe drudgery of her existence had just fractured, revealing a darkness she hadn't known was lurking so close. The silence Vaughn left behind was thicker than the dust motes dancing in the weak attic light. His question, "What did he mean by that, widow? You know something?" hung in the stale air like poison gas. Abigail felt its corrosive touch seep into her pores. The chipped enamel dipper trembled in her hand, forgotten water dripping onto the rough wooden floorboards of the storeroom. She stared at the closed back door, the space where Jacob Holt had stood moments before, carrying his cryptic observation, an unsettling stillness out into gray Kansas afternoon. A woman running hard, riderless horse, missing folk. The words echoed the desperate flight from the storm she hadn't witnessed, but felt in her bones. The phantom woman, the bone hairpin lost. How did Holt know? And why tell her? Vaughn's small, dark eyes, stripped of their shopkeeper's veneer, had revealed the predator beneath. His suspicion was a tangible thing now, a new shackle added to the chains of debt and labor. He hadn't waited for her stammered denial. He'd simply watched her, that cold calculation back in place, before turning on his polished heel and returning to the front counter. The dismissal was more frightening than shouting. It meant he was thinking, plotting. Abigail forced her legs to move, climbing the narrow stairs back to her attic prison. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted by fear and the relentless drag of exhaustion. The unfinished mending pile mocked her from the stool. Vaughn's demand to double her output wasn't just cruel, it was impossible. Her back screamed, a dull, persistent ache radiating around the curve of her belly, where Samuel's child pressed against her ribs. She sank onto the cot, the thin straw mattress offering no comfort. Closing her eyes, she pressed her hands against her swollen middle, seeking the familiar flutter, the tiny kicks that were her only solace. Hold on, little one. Please hold on. Memory, unbidden and sharp, sliced through the fear. Samuel, not in death but in life, laughing, sweat gleaming on his brow as he wrestled a stubborn fence post into the hard prairie earth near their small homestead. "Gotta be deeper, Abby girl," he called, his voice warm and rich as sun-warm honey. "Prairie wind's got teeth. Want to pull it right out." He looked up, catching her gaze as she brought him a dipper of cool well water. The love in his eyes, fierce and protective, had been her anchor. That fence post had held. He hadn't. The plowshare, the sudden stillness, the suffocating silence that followed. That homestead, their dream, sold to pay the undertaker and the initial debts, leaving her adrift, easy prey for Vaughn's contract. The memory was a double-edged knife. It cut with loss, but also reminded her of the strength Samuel had seen in her, strength she needed now more than ever. The attic door didn't open again that day, but Vaughn's presence was felt. Twice, his heavy footsteps paused outside her door, a silent, menacing reminder. When she descended for her meager supper ration, cold beans and a heel of stale bread, he was behind the counter, ostensibly reviewing his ledger. Yet she felt his gaze, sharp and assessing, follow her every move. He said nothing about Holt or missing women, but the air crackled with unspoken threat. "The mending pile, Mrs. Reed," was his only comment as she turned to leave the storefront, his voice devoid of its usual false civility. "Sundown tomorrow." All of it. The implied or else vibrated in the stillness. The next day dawned brittle and cold, a hard wind scouring the town, whistling through cracks in the attic walls like a mournful spirit. Abigail worked like an automaton, needle flashing, fingers raw and bleeding. Every stitch was a battle against fatigue, and the gnawing fear Vaughn had ignited. She rationed her water, her meager bites of bread, knowing she needed strength she didn't possess. The child moved restlessly, a constant reminder of the fragile life depending on her endurance. What if Vaughn throws me out? Where would I go? The vast, indifferent prairie outside Bleakwood offered only starvation or worse. Mid-afternoon, the bell on the mercantile door jangled with unusual force. Voices drifted up, Vaughn's, oily and accommodating, and another, deeper, rougher, tinged with impatience. Curiosity, a dangerous luxury, pricked at Abigail. She crept to the top of the stairs, staying hidden in the shadows. Below, Vaughn was talking to a man Abigail recognized as Deputy Gable. He was a lean, raw-boned man with a drooping mustache and eyes that seemed perpetually squinted against non-existent sun. He wore his tin star carelessly, his hand resting near the worn grip of his revolver. Just passing through Vaughn, Gable was saying, his voice gravelly, "Heard some talk down Red Fork way. Sheriff sent me to see if anything drifted up this direction." "Talk?" Vaughn asked, feigning mild interest while polishing a glass jar with unnecessary vigor. "Woman gone missing. Sarah Jennings. Stage passenger. Didn't arrive at Red Fork Depot 3 nights back. Stage driver swears she boarded. Just vanished." Gable spat a stream of tobacco juice near the spittoon, missing it. Some say they seen a lone rider hanging back, watching the stage road about that time. Big fella on a buckskin, scarred down his face. He tapped the side of his own cheek, mirroring the line Abigail had seen on Jacob Holt. Her breath hitched. Sarah Jennings. The name made the phantom woman real. 3 nights back, the night of the storm. Vaughn's eyes gleamed with sudden, predatory interest. "A scar, you say? Buckskin horse? Sound a mite familiar. Fella named Holt supplies out my way sometimes. Fits that description. Quiet sort, keeps to himself." He leaned conspiratorially over the counter. "Funny thing, Deputy, Holt was just in here, yesterday, asking peculiar questions himself, about a woman running in the storm. Riderless horse. Seemed mighty interested in missing folk." Vaughn let the implication hang, thick and poisonous. Gable's squint intensified. "Holt, eh? Know where he holds up. Got a small spread southwest of here." Vaughn supplied smoothly, past the old Comanche marker. "Rough place. Called it Windbreak, I think. Not that he's much for company." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Seem awful concerned about my indentured woman upstairs, too. Widow Reed, real concerned." Abigail's blood ran cold. Vaughn was weaving a web, connecting Holt to the missing woman, and now subtly dragging her into its sticky strands. She shrank back in the stairwell, heart hammering against her ribs. Vaughn wasn't just suspicious. He was actively turning Holt into a suspect, and her proximity into potential guilt by association. The weight of it pressed down, heavier than the flour sack Holt had refused to let her lift. She stumbled back to her stool, the half-mended shirt crumpled in her fist. Samuel's face swam before her eyes. Not laughing this time, but etched with worry the day he'd signed the loan note for the new plow blade. "Gotta trust sometimes, Abby," he'd said, his hand warm over hers. "But keep your eyes open." Her eyes were open now, wide with terror. Trust felt like a luxury buried with Samuel. Later, as the weak sun dipped towards the horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of ochre and deepening shadow, the back door creaked open again. Abigail, hauling a bucket of dirty mending water to dump outside, froze. Jacob Holt stood there, silhouetted against the fading light. He looked more weathered than yesterday, dustier, as if he'd ridden hard. His gray eyes swept the cluttered storeroom, landing on her, taking the bucket's weight, the pallor of her face, the raw redness of her knuckles. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. He stepped inside, closing the door against the biting wind. He didn't look toward the front store, where Vaughn's voice could be heard haggling with a customer. Abigail set the bucket down, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Mr. Holt." Her voice sounded thin, Reedy. He didn't waste words. His gaze flickered towards the stairs leading up to her attic. "Vaughn giving you trouble?" The question was direct, blunt. Abigail hesitated. To speak against Vaughn was dangerous. But Holt's presence, his quiet intensity, offered a strange, tentative anchor. "He expects the impossible," she murmured, her gaze dropping to her swollen belly. The universal language of her burden. "And since yesterday, he watches." Holt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached into his duster pocket. Not for the journal this time, but pulling out a small wrap packet. He held it out. "Jerky," he stated. "Got extra?" Abigail stared at the offering. Simple, practical sustenance. An act of kindness devoid of pity, acknowledging her need without demeaning her. It was the first untainted gesture she'd encountered since Samuel's death. Tears pricked her eyes, a confusing mix of gratitude and overwhelming weariness. She took it, her fingers brushing against his callous ones. A spark, faint but undeniable, passed between them. A shared recognition of hardship. "Thank you," she whispered, the words thick. He nodded, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer. In the dim light of the storeroom, his gray eyes seemed less like river stones and more like smoke, shifting, concealing, yet holding a hidden warmth. "My place?" "Windbreak," he said, the name confirming Vaughn's information. "Needs a steady hand. Woman's touch." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Got a room. Separate. Pays fair. Works hard, but honest. Mending. Cooking. Garden come spring." He didn't look away, letting the offer hang in the dusty air between them. An escape route. A lifeline thrown across the chasm of her despair. Abigail's breath caught. Hope, treacherous and fragile, bloomed in her chest, warring fiercely with fear. Vaughn's contract was a legal shackle. Leaving could be seen as theft of service, of the debt she owed. And Vaughn had power, the deputy, the town's ear. But the attic room was killing her, slowly crushing her and the child beneath Vaughn's greed and suspicion. Windbreak. The name sounded like sanctuary. She opened her mouth, the desperate yes trembling on her lips. Before she could speak, Holt's gaze snapped towards a small, grimy window set high in the storeroom wall. His body tensed, the stillness turning predatory. Abigail followed his look. Outside, in the gathering twilight, a figure stood across the dusty street, partially obscured by the shadow of the livery stable. Tall, broad-shouldered, watching the mercantile's back door. Watching them, Deputy Gable. Holt's hand moved, not towards his gun belt, but to the inner pocket of his duster. He pulled out the worn leather journal Abigail had glimpsed before. His expression was grim, etched with a sudden urgency she hadn't seen before. He didn't open it. Instead, he pressed it into her hands, his callous fingers closing hers around the cracked leather. It felt warm, heavy with secrets. "Hide this," he rasped, his voice low and urgent, his gray eyes locking onto hers with fierce intensity. "Don't let Vaughn see it. Don't let anyone see it. Read it if you need to know." He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, the unspoken weight of his trust, his fear, passing into her hands with the journal. "I'll be back. Dawn. Be ready." He didn't wait for her response. Turning abruptly, he pulled his hat low and slipped out the back door into the twilight, moving with the silent swiftness of shadow. The bell jangled once, sharply. Abigail stood frozen in the dim storeroom, the rough leather of the journal biting into her palm. The taste of jerky lingered on her tongue, a promise of sustenance. The offer of windbreak echoed in her mind, a promise of escape. But the deputy's watching figure burned in her vision, a harbinger of danger. And now, pressed against her thudding heart beneath her worn apron, was Jacob Holt's secret, his past, his vulnerability entrusted to her. The weight of it was terrifying. What truth lay bound within these worn pages? What had Holt done? What did he fear Vaughn or the law discovering? From the front of the store, Vaughn's voice called out, sharp and demanding, shattering the fragile silence. Mrs. Reed, stop dawdling. That water won't dump itself. The journal felt like a live coal against her skin. Sanctuary offered. A deputy watching. A desperate man's secrets burning in her hands. And Vaughn's voice a constant, tightening noose. The fragile Hope Holt had offered war with the immediate, chilling peril his journal represented. Dawn felt a lifetime away. Could she hide this? Should she? What terrible truth had Jacob Holt just entrusted to her trembling hands? Vaughn's voice, sharp as a whip crack, shattered the fragile silence of the storeroom. Mrs. Reed, stop dawdling. That water won't dump itself. The command echoed off the cluttered shelves, vibrating through Abigail's bones. The journal Jacob Holt had pressed into her hands felt like a live coal searing her palm through the rough fabric of her apron. Deputy Gable's shadowed figure, watching from across the street, seemed imprinted on her vision. Sanctuary offered. A lawman watching. A desperate man's secrets burning against her skin. And Vaughn's demand, a tightening noose. Instinct screamed, hide it. Her gaze darted wildly around the cluttered storeroom. Barrels, crates, sacks. Too obvious. Vaughn's heavy footsteps were already approaching the doorway connecting the storefront. Panic, cold and slick, coiled in her stomach. With a surge of adrenaline that momentarily overrode her exhaustion, she shoved the small, thick journal deep into the folds of her skirt, tucking it securely beneath the waistband of her worn petticoat. The rough leather scraped her skin, a constant, tangible reminder of the peril she now carried. She grabbed the bucket handle just as Vaughn's bulk filled the doorway. His small, dark eyes swept over her, lingering on her face, then dropping pointedly to the bucket. Took you long enough. Daydreaming about Cowboy's widow? His voice was laced with venomous insinuation. He took a step closer, the scent of bay rum cloying in confined space. Saw Holt skulking around back again. What business did he have with you? His gaze raked her up and down, searching for a tell, a bulge, anything out of place. Abigail kept her eyes lowered, focusing on the sloshing water in the bucket. Fear constricted her throat. He offered jerky, Mr. Vaughn. Said he had extra. It was the truth, a flimsy shield. She hefted the bucket, the weight pulling painfully at her shoulders and back. I'm dumping the water now. She moved toward the back door, her steps deliberately slow, burdened by the bucket and the far heavier secret beneath her skirts. Vaughn didn't move, blocking her path slightly. Extra jerky, he scoffed. Likely story. Men like Holt don't give without expecting something. Remember your contract, Mrs. Reed. Your time, your labor, belongs to me until the debt's paid. You consort with suspicious characters. It reflects poorly, very poorly. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Deputy Gable has questions about Holt, about that missing woman. Questions Holt might not answer. Wouldn't want you caught up in something unfortunate. Would we? Best keep your distance. His eyes narrowed. And best remember who holds the keys to your roof. The unspoken threat hung in the dusty air. Cooperate or face the consequences. Abigail nodded mutely, a tremor running through her. She sidestepped him, fumbling with the latch on the back door. The cold wind hit her face like a slap as she stepped out into the deepening twilight. She dumped the filthy water onto the hard-packed earth, the splash loud in the sudden quiet. Her eyes darted toward the livery stable across the street. The shadow was gone. Deputy Gable had vanished. Was he watching from somewhere else? Heading towards windbreak? The relief was momentary, replaced by a deeper chill. She hurried back inside, bolting the door, feeling Vaughn's gaze boring into her back as she passed it without a word and climbed the creaking stairs to her attic prison. The journal felt like a brand against her skin. She closed the attic door, leaning against it for a moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The small room felt even more claustrophobic, the air thick with dust and dread. The unfinished mending pile still mocked her from the stool. Sundown tomorrow. All of it, an impossible task made more impossible by the consuming fear and the weight pressing against her ribs, both within and without. She moved to the cot, sinking onto the thin mattress. Carefully, heart pounding, she retrieved the journal from its hiding place. The worn leather cover felt warm from her body heat, the cracked surface whispering of miles traveled and secrets held. It was small, fitting easily in her palm, bound with a simple leather thong. She traced the cover with a trembling finger. "Read it, if you need to know." Holt's urgent words echoed. What terrible truth lay bound within? The memory of Samuel surfaced, not at his death, but a quiet evening by the hearth in their tiny homestead. He'd been whittling, the shavings curling at his feet. "Truth's a heavy load, Abby," he'd said softly, looking up at her with those steady eyes. "Sometimes folks carry it 'cause they have to, not 'cause they want to, but seeing it clear, that's the only way to know which way to step." He believed in facing things head on, even the hard things. Was this truth something she needed to see? Could she bear its weight? Curiosity warred with terror. Yvonne found it, but Holt had trusted her. He'd offered sanctuary. Dawn, be ready. She needed to know what she was potentially fleeing with, what danger she was embracing. Her raw, aching fingers fumbled with the leather thong. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she opened the journal. The pages were filled with tight, angular script, black ink sometimes faded, sometimes fresh. Sketches filled the margins, a coiled rattler, the stark silhouette of a lone tree on a ridge, the intricate pattern of a spider web glistening with dew. Her heart hammered as she turned the pages. Then she froze. There, drawn with startling detail, on a page near the middle, was the hairpin. Her hairpin, the delicate bone carving, the slight curve, exactly as she'd imagined from Holt's description of finding it lost in the storm mud. Beneath it, scrawled in the same angular hand, "Found near Red Fork Trail. Storm, riderless buckskin nearby. Belonged to S.J. Sarah Jennings." The name Deputy Gable had spoken. Confirmation. Holt had found the fleeing woman's token, but the question mark lingered. Did he know her? Was he involved? She turned the page hastily, her eyes scanning the cramped writing. Entries were dated, sparse. Mentions of weather, supplies, distances traveled. Then, an entry dated just before the storm. Red Fork, Saloon, Elias V. Seen arguing with man near Stage Depot. Man looked rough. V. Handed over coin. Too much for whiskey. Felt wrong. Woman S.J. Boarded stage later. Looked scared. Eyes darting. Watched V. Watched the man. Stage left. V. And man talked after. Smiles. Not friendly smiles. Abigail's breath caught. Elias Vaughn in Red Fork, paying a rough-looking man just before Sarah Jennings boarded the stage looking frightened. The implications crashed over her like icy water. Vaughn wasn't just a greedy merchant. He might be entangled in something far darker. Was Sarah Jennings running from Vaughn? Was the man he paid? Her mind recoiled from the thought, but the journal entry painted a picture far removed from Holt being the villain Vaughn, and Gable suggested. Holt had been watching Vaughn. He suspected him. A wave of nausea, unrelated to pregnancy, washed over her. The journal wasn't just Holt's past. It was a dangerous present, and she held it. She snapped it shut, reading the thong with fumbling fingers. Where to hide it now? The trunk? Too obvious if Vaughn searched. Under the mattress? Risky. Her gaze fell on the small, grimy window. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the frame. An idea sparked desperate. She pushed the stool under the window. Standing on it, she could just reach the narrow ledge outside. The wood was weathered, a gap visible where the frame didn't quite meet the siding. Heart pounding, she shoved the small journal deep into the gap, wedging it tightly into the dark space. She quickly wiped away telltale dust from the sill and climbed down, replacing the stool. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than on her person. The rest of the night was a torment. Every creak of the building, every footstep below, sent jolts of fear through her. She forced herself to mend, her fingers moving mechanically, her mind a whirlwind of the journal's revelations, Vaughn's threats, Holt's urgent promise. Dawn, be ready. Could she trust him? The journal suggested he was trying to uncover the truth about Sarah Jennings, not perpetrate it. He'd seen Vaughn's hand in it. He'd trusted her with the evidence. That had to mean something. Samuel's words about truth echoed. She needed to step toward the light Holt offered, however dangerous. Sleep was impossible. She lay on the cot, listening to the wind scream around the eaves, feeling the child turn restlessly within her. The jerky Holt had given her was a small lump of comfort in her pocket, a tangible link to his unexpected kindness. She clutched the fabric of her dress over her belly. Hold on, little one. Dawn is coming. The sky was still the deep, bruised purple of pre-dawn when a soft, rhythmic sound cut through the wind's howl. Not a knock, but a gentle scrape against the back door downstairs. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. She was already dressed, having given up on sleep hours ago. Her meager belongings, an extra dress, Samuel's worn Bible, the jerky, wrapped in a shawl. She crept down the stairs, her movements silent as a shadow, every sense straining. The storeroom was pitch black, smelling of dust and burlap. She unbolted the back door, opening it just a crack. Jacob Holt stood there, a solid silhouette against the barely lightening sky. He was hatless, his dark hair tousled by the wind, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He held the reins of 2 horses, his familiar buckskin, and a smaller, sturdy bay mare already saddled. A worn canvas sack was slung over his shoulder. His gray eyes found hers in the gloom, intense and watchful. Ready? His voice was a low rasp, barely audible over the wind. Abigail nodded, her throat too tight for words. She slipped out, pulling the shawl tight around her shoulders and the small bundle against her chest. The cold bit deep, but it was a cold of freedom, not the damp chill of the attic. Holt didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, handing her the bay mare's reins. Her name's Daisy. Steady. He then lifted the canvas sack. Supplies for the trail, and he reached in, pulling out a thick, folded wool blanket. For you. He draped it over her shoulders. The coarse wool was heavy, scratchy, but blessedly warm, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and horse. The simple act, the blanket, the steady mare, the supplies, undid her. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in her eyes. It wasn't just shelter, it was care, dignity. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking. Holt's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. He gave a curt nod, then turned to secure the sack behind his saddle. Mount up, we ride before the town stirs. He cupped his hands, offering her a boost onto Daisy. Abigail hesitated only a second, then placed her foot in his linked hands. His strength was surprising, lifting her effortlessly into the saddle despite her bulk. She settled herself, adjusting the blanket, the unfamiliar feel of the leather both daunting and exhilarating. Holt swung onto the buckskin with fluid ease. They moved out of the alley behind the mercantile, turning onto the main street of Bleakwood. It was deserted, bathed in the eerie gray light of false dawn. Buildings huddled like sleeping beasts. Only the wind spoke, keening through the eaves. Holt set a brisk but manageable pace, heading southwest out of town. Abigail focused on Daisy's rhythmic gait. The solid feel of the horse beneath her, the vast, open prairie beckoning ahead. Windbreak, sanctuary. The journal secret felt slightly less crushing out here, though still hidden deep in a window gap. She risked a glance back at the mercantile, a dark shape shrinking behind them. No light showed in Vaughn's window. Yet, they rode in silence for perhaps half an hour, putting miles between them and Bleakwood. The sky lightened to a pale, washed-out blue, streaked with pink on the eastern horizon. The endless expanse of the Kansas prairie unfolded around them, sagebrush silver with frost, the frozen earth crunching under the horses' hooves. The immensity was both terrifying and liberating. Abigail breathed deep, the cold air clearing her head. She glanced at Holt riding slightly ahead. His profile was stern, etched with concentration, constantly scanning the horizon. Why? The word escaped her before she could stop it, surprising even herself. Why help me? Why risk this? She gestured vaguely back towards Bleakwood, towards Vaughn and Gable. Holt didn't look at her immediately. He guided his horse around a patch of icy ground. When he spoke, his voice was low, carried away slightly by the wind. Saw enough folks ground down by the likes of Vaughn, he said, his words measured. Exploit in desperation. Ain't right. He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where a low ridge began to rise. And the woman, Sarah Jennings. He finally glanced at her, his gray eyes holding a depth of pain that startled her. Couldn't help her. Was too late. The raw regret in his voice was unmistakable. Didn't aim to be too late again. It wasn't the whole story. Abigail knew it. The journal hinted at more, his suspicion of Vaughn, his watching, but was a fragment of truth offered, a glimpse past the guarded walls. He hadn't harmed Sarah. He'd tried to understand her flight, her fear. He carried the guilt of failing her. And now, he was acting to prevent failing Abigail, a fragile thread of understanding, woven from shared hardship and his quiet integrity, stretched between them on the vast, empty plain. She touched the wool blanket around her shoulders. I'm grateful, Mr. Holt. Jacob, he said quietly, looking straight ahead again. Abigail, she replied, a flicker of warmth piercing the cold fear. They crested the low ridge. Below them, nestled in a shallow, wind-scoured valley, lay a cluster of buildings. A small, sturdy cabin with a stone chimney, smoke already wisping into the morning air. A lean-to barn, a corral, a fenced area that might become a garden come spring. It was rough-hewn, isolated, but it looked solid. Windbreak, a faint, almost imperceptible easing of the tension in Jacob's shoulders told her they'd arrived. He pointed. Home. He nudged his horse forward down the slope. Relief, profound and dizzying, washed over Abigail. They'd made it. They were away from Vaughn, away from the attic. She followed Jacob down the slope, Daisy picking her way carefully on the frozen ground. As they neared the cabin, movement near the barn caught her eye. A figure stepped out, leaning against the doorframe, watching their approach. Not Jacob's ranch hand. She'd imagined someone older, perhaps. This man was younger, lean, with a sharp face and eyes that missed nothing. He wore a heavy coat, but the glint of a tin star was visible on his lapel. Deputy Gable. He pushed himself off the doorframe, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. A cold smile touched his lips as he watched Jacob rein in his buckskin near the cabin porch. His gaze then slid to Abigail, still mounted on Daisy, her relief freezing into solid dread in her veins. Well now, Holt, Gable drawled, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. His eyes were hard, fixed on Jacob. Fancy meeting you here, just as the sun comes up, and brought company, I see. He took a deliberate step forward, his boot crunching on the frost. Got a few more questions about that stagecoach, about Sarah Jennings. His hand drifted closer to his gun, and about why you felt the need to spirit away Mr. Vaughn's indentured woman before sunup. His gaze flickered back to Abigail, lingering on her frightened face, then down to the bundle clutched to her chest. Seems awful suspicious indeed. Abigail's breath stopped. They hadn't escaped. The law was waiting, and Vaughn's shadow stretched even here, to the threshold of the sanctuary she'd barely glimpsed. Jacob sat rigidly in his saddle, his face an unreadable mask, but Abigail saw the tension coiling in him, the way his own hand hovered, ever so slightly, near the worn leather of his gun belt. The fragile hope of windbreak shattered before they could even step inside. Deputy Gable stood between them in safety, his smile cold, his questions lethal. The journal's damning secrets felt exposed, even hidden miles away. What would Gable do? What could Jacob do? The vast, watchful prairie offered no answers, only the biting wind and the deputy's unwavering, accusing stare. The frigid air at windbreak crackled like thin ice under a boot. Deputy Gable's cold smile didn't reach his eyes, fixed on Jacob Holt with the unwavering intensity of a predator sighting wounded prey. His hand rested near his holster revolver, a silent, lethal punctuation to his accusations. Abigail sat frozen on Daisy's back. The coarse wool blanket Jacob had given her suddenly feeling like a shroud. The fragile hope of sanctuary, glimpsed only moments before in the smoke curling from the cabin chimney, shattered into shards of dread. We didn't escape. Vaughn's reach is longer than the prairie. Jacob didn't move from his saddle. His posture remained rigid, a statue carved from prairie granite. Only the slight tightening of his jaw beneath the dark stubble betrayed the tension coiling within him. His own hand hovered near the worn leather of his gun belt, not touching it, but poised. His gray eyes, usually distant as river stones, were fixed on Gable with focused intensity that held no fear, only a deep, wary calculation. Suspicious, deputy? Jacob's voice was low, gravelly, cutting through the wind's keen. Bringing a woman out of indentured service to Vaughn? That ain't suspicious. That's common decency. Something you might recall if the badge meant more than just collecting Vaughn's favors. He didn't look at Abigail, but his words were a shield thrown around her, acknowledging the truth of her plight. Gable's smile vanished, replaced by a hard sneer. Decency? Is that what you call it? Skulking out of Bleakwood before dawn with another man's contracted labor? Looks a lot like theft to me. Holt and Vaughn's plenty riled. Claims you've been stirring trouble. A skin, peculiar questions about that missing woman, Sarah Jennings. He took a deliberate step forward, his boot crunching loudly on the frost-rimed earth. Seems mighty coincidental. You finned in that riderless horse near where she vanished. You be seen near Red Fork, about that time. Scar on your face matching a description. His gaze flicked back to Abigail, sharp and probing. And now you got her here. What did she see, Holt? What did you tell her? Abigail's breath hitched. The journal's damning entry about Vaughn paying a rough man in Red Fork burned in her mind. Tell him. A voice screamed inside her. Tell him about Vaughn. But fear, cold and slick, held her tongue. Gable worked with Vaughn. He'd likely dismiss it, or worse, twist it against her. She was a penniless widow, indentured. Her word against a merchant and the law? Samuel's face swam before her. Not laughing now, but earnest, holding her gaze a day that argued about trusting a smooth-talking horse trader. Evidence, Abby girl, he'd said, tapping his temple. Words are wind. You need proof before you speak against a man with power. She had proof, but it was miles away, hidden in a window gap in Bleakwood. Useless. Jacob shifted slightly in his saddle, the leather creaking. I asked questions because a woman vanished, Gable. That's all. Found the horse wandering. Tried to find her. Found a hairpin instead. His voice was flat, factual. As for Mrs. Reed, he finally glanced at Abigail, a fleeting look that held a depth of reassurance that startled her. She needed honest work and a roof that didn't come with chains. Offered it. She accepted. Ain't no crime in that. Vaughn's contract ain't slavery, though he acts like it is. Honest work. Gable scoffed. Or keeping her close? Out of the way. He took another step, closing the distance. I think I'll take a look inside your cabin, Holt. See what secrets you're keeping out here on the edge of nowhere. His hand drifted closer to his gun, and the widow comes with me, back to Bleakwood. Vaughn wants his property accounted for. Panic surged through Abigail hot and sharp. Back to the attic? Back to Vaughn's vengeance? The child within her kicked violently, a protest against the tightening noose. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't. The memory of Samuel's strength, his belief in facing things head-on, surged within her. She wasn't just property. She was Abigail Reed, carrying Samuel's child. She found her voice, thin but clear, cutting through the tension. "I ain't his property, Deputy." She met Gable's surprised gaze. "I'm Abigail Reed. I signed a paper for room and board, paid in labor, didn't sign my soul. And Mr. Holt offered me work. Fair work. I took it. That's all there is." She clutched a bundle tighter to her chest, the jerky within it a small, hard reminder of Jacob's unexpected kindness. If you got questions about Sarah Jennings, ask Elias Vaughn why he was paid a rough-looking man coined by the Red Fork Stage Depot just before she boarded, looking scared half to death. The words hung in the frozen air, stark and dangerous. Gable's eyes widened fractionally, then narrowed into slits. Jacob's head snapped towards her, his expression unreadable, but a flicker of something, surprise, approval, crossed his face. "Vaughn!" Gable's voice lost some of its bluster, replaced by wary calculation. "What nonsense is this, widow? Trying to throw dirt to save your cowboy." "It ain't nonsense," Abigail insisted, drawing courage from Jacob's steady presence beside her. "It's—" She faltered. She couldn't mention the journal. Not without it here. "It's what folks saw. Ask in Red Fork. Ask if Vaughn was there." Gable studied her, then Jacob, his mind visibly working. Vaughn paying someone near the stage? It didn't fit the narrative he'd been fed. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Finally, Jacob moved. Slowly, deliberately, he swung down from his buckskin. He didn't approach Gable, but walked toward the cabin porch, his movements calm, deliberate. He stopped, turned to face the deputy. "Search if you got a warrant, Gable," he said, his voice low but carrying. "Otherwise, you're trespassing. As for Mrs. Reed..." He looked at Abigail, his gray eyes holding hers. "She stays. She's under my roof now. My protection." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. A declaration, a line drawn in the frost. Gable's hand tightened on his gun. His jaw worked. He clearly wanted to push, to force his way in, to drag Abigail back. But Jacob's quiet defiance, Abigail's unexpected accusation, and a lack of immediate, damning evidence gave him pause. The wind whipped his coat, emphasizing the standoff. He spat onto the frozen ground. "This ain't over. Hope. Vaughn ain't gonna take this lying down. And that woman..." He jabbed a finger towards Abigail. "She's part of it now. You mark my words." He took a step back, then another, his eyes never leaving Jacob. "I'll be back. With a warrant. And maybe Vaughn himself. He's mighty interested in finding something the widow left behind." He turned abruptly, stomping towards a saddle horse tethered near the barn. He mounted with rough efficiency, cast one last hard look at them, and spurred the horse back toward the ridge in the distant smear of Bleakwood. The tension didn't dissipate with Gable's departure. It merely shifted, settling over windbreak like a heavier frost. Abigail slid down from Daisy, her legs trembling. Jacob moved swiftly to her side, his hand briefly steadying her elbow. The contact was fleeting, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her icy fear. "You spoke up," he said quietly, his gaze searching her face. There was no reproach, only a quiet acknowledgement. I had to," Abigail whispered, her voice shaking. "He was wrong. About you. About me." She looked towards the empty ridge where Gable had vanished. He mentioned, "Vaughn looking for something I left behind." Jacob's expression darkened. "The journal?" It wasn't a question. Abigail nodded mutely. The secret felt heavier than ever. Jacob guided her towards the cabin door. Inside, out of the wind. He pushed the heavy plank door open. Warmth, wood smoke, and the faint scent of coffee washed over them. The cabin was Spartan but solid. A stone hearth with crackling fire, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cot in the corner. shelves holding basic supplies. It spoke of solitude and self-sufficiency. Jacob took her bundle and the blanket, gesturing her towards a hearth. "Sit, warm yourself. I'll see to the horses." Abigail sank onto one of the chairs, holding her hands towards the blessed heat of the flames. The events of the morning crashed over her. The flight, the confrontation, the nearness of Gable's gun. Exhaustion warred with residual terror. Jacob returned shortly, moving with quiet efficiency. He hung his duster and hat on a peg, revealing a warm but clean plaid shirt. He poured coffee from a pot simmering at the edge of the hearth into a chipped enamel mug and handed it to her. The simple act of care, of providing warmth and sustenance, was profoundly moving after Vaughn's calculated cruelty. "Thank you," she murmured, the steam warming her face. Jacob leaned against the heavy table, his arms crossed, watching the flames. The firelight danced in his gray eyes, softening the harsh lines of his face, revealing the weariness beneath the guarded exterior. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like a shared breath after a storm. He mentioned Red Fork. Jacob said finally, his voice low, "What you said, it lines up with what I saw." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah Jennings, she wasn't just some stranger. She was my sister." Abigail gasped softly, the mug trembling in her hands. His sister. The grief in his voice when he'd said couldn't help her suddenly made agonizing sense. The journal, his watchfulness, his desperation. It wasn't just justice. It was family. "She wrote me," Jacob continued, his gaze fixed on the fire. "Said she was coming out west. Wanted a fresh start. Was meeting someone about work near Red Fork." His jaw tightened. "Never said who. Just that it paid good. Too good, likely. I was drifting up near the Nebraska line. Got her letter late. Rode hard for Red Fork. Got there the day after the storm." He swallowed, the memory raw. Heard about the stage. Her not Erevan. Found the horse. Found the hairpin I'd carved for her years back. He looked at Abigail, the pain stark in his eyes. Then I saw Vaughn, talking smooth to the sheriff. Paying that man, the one who looked like trouble. Saw the look on his face when Sarah's name was mentioned. Cold, satisfied, like a cat that got the cream. His fist clenched briefly on the tabletop. I knew he was tangled in it. But proof is hard to come by when a man like Vaughn has the law in his pocket. Like Gable. Abigail's heart ached for him. The loss, the frustration, the guilt, she understood it all too well. The journal, she breathed. My notes, he confirmed. What I saw, what I suspected. Dates, names I could catch. It's all I had. Proof Vaughn was involved. Somehow, maybe hired that man to intercept her? Scare her off whatever deal he promised? I don't know. But she ran into that storm. He looked at Abigail, his gaze intense. Give it to you, it was a risk. But Vaughn watching me, Gable watching, I figured maybe the one place he wouldn't look was on you, hid in plain sight. He gave a humorless grunt. Turns out, he looked anyway. The pieces fell into place for Abigail. His protectiveness, his immediate offer of sanctuary. It wasn't just kindness. It was a fierce determination born of failing his sister. He wouldn't fail another woman in Vaughn's shadow. The fragile thread of trust between them thickened into a sturdy cord. We have to get it back, she said urgently, before Vaughn finds it. It's proof against him. Jacob nodded grimly. We will, but first we ford up. Gable said he's coming back with Vaughn, and Vaughn wants that book bad. He pushed away from the table. Rest. Warm up. I'll check the perimeter, bring in more wood. Abigail watched him pull his duster back on, his movements purposeful. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but was tempered now by a fierce resolve. She wasn't alone. She had an ally, a man driven by a grief that mirrored her own, fighting against the same predator. She touched her belly. Hold on, little one. We're fighting now. Jacob had just shouldered the door open, stepping into the late morning light, when a sound cut through the wind's moan. Not hoofbeats approaching from the ridge, but the distinct, sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing across the valley. Abigail froze, mug halfway to her lips. Jacob dropped instantly into a crouch behind the porch rail, his hand flying to his gun. His head snapped toward the sound, coming not from the ridge road, but from the rocky outcrops flanking the western side of the valley. Another shot rang out, closer this time. A puff of dust kicked up near the corner of the barn. Then a voice, harsh and unfamiliar, yelled from the rocks. "Holt, send the woman out. Vaughn wants his property, and he really wants that little book she hid." A pause and a cruel laugh. "Come peaceful like, or we start burning. Your precious windbreak down around your ears." Abigail's blood turned to ice. Vaughn hadn't waited for Gable or a warrant. He'd sent hired guns, and they knew about the journal. They'd found it. The fragile sanctuary was surrounded. Jacob, crouched low, met her terrified eyes through the open door. The grim set of his face confirmed the truth. The siege had begun. Vaughn wasn't coming to talk. He was coming to take. And he wouldn't care who got hurt in the process. The crackle of the fire inside seemed suddenly fragile against the echoing threat from the rocks. The journal was found. The guns were here. And the fragile haven of windbreak had just become a trap. The rifle shot's echo died, leaving a silence more profound and menacing than the wind's constant whine. The harsh command, "Send the woman out. Vaughn wants his property, or we start burning," hung in the frigid air like against smoke. Abigail stood frozen inside the cabin doorway, the chipped enamel mug cold and forgotten in her hand. Outside, Jacob Holt was a crouched shadow behind the porch rail, his hand steady on his gun, his gaze scanning the rocky outcrops where the shooter hid. The fragile sanctuary of windbreak had vanished. They were trapped, surrounded, and Vaughn knew about the journal. He'd found it. The thought was a cold knife in her gut. Jacob moved with the lethal grace of cougar in one fluid motion. He lunged back through the doorway, slamming the heavy plank door shut and dropping the thick crossbar into place. The solid thunk reverberated through the small cabin, a desperate barricade against the storm outside. Dust motes danced wildly in the sudden gloom, illuminated only by the flickering firelight that now seemed frail against the threat. "Get down! Away from the windows!" Jacob rasped, his voice tight. He grabbed a heavy wooden crate and shoved it against the door for good measure. "Stay low, near the hearth." His gray eyes met hers, stripped bare of their usual guarded distance, revealing only fierce protectiveness and grim calculation. "They won't rush yet. They'll try to flush us out, or wait for Vaughn." Abigail scrambled to the stone hearth, crouching low beside the fire, its warmth a stark contrast to the icy fear seizing her. The child within her kicked violently, a frantic echo of her own terror. Samuel, his face surfaced, not in grief, but in fierce determination. The day their well rope snapped, plunging the bucket into the dark depths. Samuel hadn't hesitated. He'd rigged a new pulley from scrap wood and sheer will, his hands bleeding, his face set. "Ain't no problem can't be met head on, Abby girl," he panted, hauling the first fresh bucket up. "Just gotta find the right lever." The memory was a spark in the darkness. She wasn't helpless. She had a lever, the truth, and it was out there in Bleakwood, wedged in her window. Another shot cracked, closer this time. A splintering thwack as a bullet punched through the shuttered window beside the door, sending with fragments flying. Abigail flinched, covering her head. Jacob, pressed against the wall beside the damaged shutter, peered through a narrow gap. "2, maybe 3, he muttered, his voice low and hard. "In the rocks west. Probably more coming." He glanced back at her, his jaw tight. "Vaughn wants that book silenced. Bad. He'll be here soon." The journal, proof of Vaughn's payment, his connection to the man who terrified Sarah Jennings. Proof that could shatter his respectable merchant facade and link him to whatever fate befell Jacob's sister. Abigail's mind raced, fueled by Samuel's remembered resolve. The hired guns were focused here on Windbreak. Bleakwood might be less guarded now. If she could get there, if she could retrieve the journal before Vaughn destroyed it. "It's not here," Abigail said suddenly, her voice surprisingly steady. Jacob looked at her sharply. "The journal? I hid it in the attic window gap at the mercantile. Before we left, Vaughn found a hiding place empty, but he doesn't know where it is. Only I do." Jacob stared at her, comprehension dawning, then wariness. "Bleakwood? It's miles. Through them." He jerked his head toward the unseen shooters. "They're watching here," Abigail insisted, the plan forming with desperate clarity. "They expect us to stay put, wait for Vaughn. If I can slip out, use the draw behind the barn." She pictured the land Jacob had ridden her over, a shallow, brush-choked gully snaking eastward away from the shooter's position. "I know the way back. I can get it. Bring it here. Or find Gable. Force him to see." "It's suicide," Jacob stated flatly, but a flicker of reluctant respect lit his eyes. He moved swiftly to a heavy trunk near the cot, lifting the lid. Inside, nestled beside folded blankets, lay a second revolver, older but well cared for, and a box of shells. He grabbed them. "You know how to use one of these?" Abigail hesitated, then nodded. Samuel had taught her the basics, years ago, insisting every soul on the frontier should know. "Point, pull, pray," she whispered, the old lesson surfacing. Jacob shoved the gun and a handful of shells into her hands. "Praying helps. So does shooting straight if you have to." He moved to the rear wall, where a smaller, shuttered window looked out towards a lean-to barn and the beginning of the draw. "I'll draw their fire. East side. When you hear the shots, you go fast and low. Follow the draw as far as it takes you. Don't look back. Get the book. Then..." He paused, meeting her eyes again. The trust he'd placed in her with the journal was nothing compared to this. "Then you decide. Bring it back if you can. If it's too hot, find the sheriff in Red Fork. His name's Macklin. Show him. Tell him everything. About Vaughn. About Sarah. About me." The wave had settled on her, immense and terrifying, but intertwined with a fierce purpose. She nodded, gripping the cold metal of the revolver. "I will." Jacob didn't hesitate. He moved to the damaged front window, took a deep breath, then kicked the shattered shutter outward. Immediately, a volley of shots rang out, splintering wood and thudding into the doorframe. Jacob returned fire, 2 sharp cracks from his own revolver aimed toward the western rocks. "Now!" he yelled. Adrenaline surged, burning away the exhaustion and fear. Abigail wrenched open the rear shutter. Cold air blasted in. She threw herself out, landing hard on the frozen ground, scrambling on hands and knees toward the meager cover of the barn's corner. Bullets whined overhead, but they were focused on Jacob's position at the front. She reached the barn, pressed herself flat against the rough wood, heart hammering against her ribs. The mouth of the draw was 20 yards away, a tangle of bare scrub willow and frozen earth. She took a ragged breath, clutched the revolver, and ran. She ran as she hadn't run since childhood, low and weaving, the cold air tearing at her lungs, her pregnant body protesting with every jarring step. Bullets kicked up dirt near her feet. One of the shooters had spotted her movement. She didn't look back. She reached the lip of the draw and half slid, half fell into its concealing depths. Scrambling to her feet, she plunged into the brush, the sound of gunfire at Windbreak fading behind her, replaced by the frantic rasp of her own breath and the wind's mournful song. The miles to Bleakwood passed in a haze of cold terror and burning determination. She avoided the main trail, sticking to draws and low ground, guided by the desperate memory of the journal wedged in the window gap. The sun climbed, weak and pale, doing little to warm the frozen land. She reached the edge of Bleakwood near midday, approaching from the back alleys. The town seemed unnaturally quiet, tense. She saw Vaughn's mercantile, its windows dark. Creeping down the familiar alley, She reached the back stairs. No sign of Vaughn or his usual boy. She climbed, her legs screaming, every creak of it sounding like a gunshot. The attic room was as she left it, cold and dusty. She shoved the stool under the window, climbed up, and scrabbled frantically at the gap in the weathered siding. Her fingers closed on rough leather. She pulled the journal free, clutching it to her chest like a talisman. A sound below, boots on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate. Vaughn's voice, cold and furious, drifted up. Tear this place apart. Find it. It has to be here. Abigail froze. He was back and searching. Panic threatened to paralyze her. She couldn't go back down the stairs. The window. It was small, but she'd squeezed through it once to clean the outside ledge years ago. Desperation lent her strength. She shoved the journal into her bodice, wrenched the window open, ignoring the protesting shriek of frozen paint, and squeezed through, dropping onto the narrow ledge. She clung for a heart-stopping moment, then lowered herself, hanging by her fingertips before dropping the last few feet into the alley below. She landed hard, rolling, pain lancing through her ankle, but the journal was safe. She limped around the corner, straight into Deputy Gable. He stood near the Mercantile's front porch, looking harried and angry. He started at the sight of her, muddy, disheveled, wild-eyed. Mrs. Reed? What in blazes? Abigail didn't hesitate. She pulled the journal from her bodice, thrusting it towards him. Proof, Deputy. Proof of what Vaughn did. Proof about Sarah Jennings. He paid a man in Red Fork to scare her. He's behind it, and he's got men shooting up Jacob Holt's place right now to cover it up. Read it. Gable stared at the worn leather book, then at her desperate face, then back toward the Mercantile where Vaughn's voice still ranted. Doubt war with duty on his face. He snatched the journal, flipped it open roughly, his eyes scanning a page. His face paled. He flipped another page. The color drained further, replaced by a dawning horror. The entry about Vaughn paying the rough man. The date, the location by the stage depot. Good Lord, he breathed. He looked up at Abigail, his expression transformed. Shame, anger. Holt's place? Now. Windbreak. He's got hired guns. Jacob's alone. Abigail gasped. Gable didn't waste another second. He shoved the journal into his coat pocket, drew his revolver, and let out a piercing whistle. Two men, lounging near the livery, looked up. Jenkins, Murphy, saddle up, rifles. Now, trouble at Holt's windbreak. Vaughn's gone loco. He turned back to Abigail, his voice urgent. Get inside the sheriff's office. Lock the door. Now! He didn't wait, sprinting towards the livery. Abigail didn't go to the sheriff's office. She limped toward the livery, ignoring the pain. Jenkins tossed her the reins of a saddled horse. Can you ride, ma'am? I can, Abigail said, hauling herself up with a grunt of pain and effort. She wouldn't hide. She needed to see it end. She needed to see Jacob safe. The ride back to Windbreak was a blur of pounding hooves and cold wind biting her face. They crested the ridge overlooking the valley as the sun began its descent, casting long, cold shadows. Below, the scene was frozen chaos. Two riderless horses stood nervously near the rocks. Smoke curled from a small fire near the barn, an attempt to flush Jacob out that had failed. The cabin door was scarred but intact. Jacob's buckskin was gone from the corral. He was moving, fighting back. Then they saw them, near the western outcrop. Three figures. Two hired guns crouched behind rocks, firing towards the barn. And Elias Vaughn, standing exposed, his face purple with rage, bellowing at the cabin. Think you can steal from me? Think you can hide? Give me that book, Holt, or I swear I'll burn that woman and her bastard child. A single shot rang out, sharp and precise, not from the cabin or the rocks, but from higher up on the ridge opposite. Vaughn's rant cut off. He staggered, clutching his shoulder, a look of utter shock on his face. Jacob Holt rose from behind a boulder further up the slope, rifle smoking, his face a mask of cold fury. Gable didn't hesitate. "Hold your fire." "Sheriff's deputy," he bellowed, charging down the slope with Jenkins and Murphy, guns drawn. "Vaughn, you're under arrest. You too. Drop your weapons. Now!" The hired guns, seeing the law arrive and their employer wounded, exchanged a panicked look. One dropped his rifle, raising his hands. The other hesitated, then followed suit. Vaughn sank to his knees, groaning, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his empire of greed crumbling around him. Jacob lowered his rifle, his gaze sweeping the scene until it found Abigail still mounted near Gable. Relief, profound and deep, washed over his weathered face. He gave a curt nod. Gable reached Vaughn, roughly hauling him to his feet. He pulled the journal from his pocket, thrusting it under Vaughn's nose. "Recognize this, Elias. Recognize your own handiwork. Pay in Jed Hooper to discourage Sarah Jennings from claiming that land near Red Fork you wanted to grab cheap. Scare her onto that stage looking like a ghost. Well, Hooper talked before he skipped town. Confirmed it all. Sarah Jennings ran from you. Elias ran into that storm. We found her body this morning, Elias, frozen in a gully 5 miles out. You killed her as sure as if you pulled the trigger yourself." Gable's voice was thick with disgust. "You're finished." Vaughn's defiance crumpled. He sagged in Gable's grip, a broken, venomous husk. "Stupid woman. Wouldn't listen. Just wanted her gone." Jacob turned away, his shoulders slumping for a moment under the weight of the confirmed loss. He walked slowly toward the cabin, past the subdued hired guns, past Gable securing Vaughn. Abigail slid down from her horse, wincing as her ankle took weight, and limped towards him. He met her halfway. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, the exhaustion, the grief, but also a dawning peace in his gray eyes. He saw the journal in Gable's hand, the proof delivered. He saw her muddy, limping but alive, defiant. He reached out, not touching her, but his hand hovering near her arm. "You got it," he stated, his voice rough. "I did," Abigail whispered, "and I brought help." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Reckon you did." He looked toward the cabin, smoke still wisping from the chimney, windbreak still standing. "Thanks to you," she said, looking around at the scar door, the bullet-pocked barn. The violence of the day pressed in, but the silence now was different. It was the silence after the storm. She touched her swollen belly. The child was quiet, as if resting after the ordeal. Hope, fragile but tenacious, unfurled within her. "Deputy Gable," he said, "Vaughn's contract, it's void. Illegal indenturement. I'm free." Jacob nodded, absorbing it. He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in her exhaustion, her courage, the life she carried. "The room, the one I offered. It's yours, for as long as you need, for the little one." He paused and added gruffly, "The garden could use a woman's touch. Come spring." Abigail looked at Windbreak, not as a temporary refuge under siege, but as a place scarred yet standing strong. Like Jacob, like herself, a place where dignity wasn't bartered, but given freely, where Samuel's child could know safety, where the ghosts of the past, Samuel's laughter, Sarah's flight, could find a measure of peace. She met Jacob's steady gaze, seeing not just a guarded cowboy, but the man who fought for his sister, who offered sanctuary, who trusted her with his truth. The bond forged in desperation, and fire felt solid, real, a foundation. "It's a good place," she said softly, a genuine warmth spreading through her despite the cold and the lingering fear. "A place to build something, to heal." She looked toward the small patch of earth near the cabin, imagining rows of carrots, beans, maybe even flowers. Come spring, a garden sounds right. Jacob held her gaze for a long moment. The wind still swept the valley, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke, but the keening edge was gone. It was just the wind now, sweeping clean the frozen prairie. He gave a slow nod, a silent agreement, a shared vision for fragile future blooming amidst the ruins of the past. He gestured towards the cabin door, its barricade now a symbol of survival. Let's get inside, out of the cold. Together, they walked towards a warmth, leaving the echoes of gunfire and Vaughn's curses fading into the vast, watchful silence of the Kansas plains. The storm had passed, the long night was over, and the promise of dawn of spring, of a life rebuilt with dignity and the quiet strength of shared trust lay ahead.